Good morning, everybody. Somebody mistook PwC for the BBC, so I think that's why I've ended up with a microphone. This is purely for recording purposes and no other ones only. Right, my name's Mark Schofield. As I said, I'm a partner with PwC in London. My background is in tax, but I also have a specialist interest in sustainability and climate change. Right, tax. Everybody's come here to talk about tax, and I thought it might just be useful just to sort of quickly go around the room and see what sort of taxes people think that they pay. So any thoughts on where do you pay taxes, or what sorts of taxes do you pay, just as individuals? So we've got some PAYE, we had some VAT, we had an airport tax, we had some sin taxes, which are typically things like cigarettes and alcohol. What sort of other taxes are there that people have? Subsidies. Excellent. Okay. Feed-in tariffs. Fuel taxes. Yep. Yep. Okay. Forest tax. Tourist taxes. Right, yep. Yep.
Disaster levies.
Right, we're going to stop there because this is going to turn into a tax session soon, which we definitely don't want. But what you can very easily see from that is there's an awful lot of taxes around. There's a huge number of taxes, and what that leads to then is to think about taxes in the context of behavioural change. And one of the things I sometimes describe myself, when people say describe your job, I describe myself as a tax behavioural psychologist, which is a very grand title for being a tax accountant. But I quite like that when people go, really? They go, what do you mean by that? They go, well, we look at how taxes change people's behaviour. And if you think about all of those taxes there's a number of those that are becoming increasingly popular with governments for 2 or 3 different reasons. One is they raise a lot of money. So let's think about in the context of the UK. If the UK put 1 pence on a fuel duty on a litre of petrol, how much money does anybody think that raises? Rough guess.
2 billion.
Raises £500 million. Just 1 penny on fuel duty. So we had the UK budget a couple of weeks ago, and they reduced fuel duty by 1 pence. And you reduce fuel duty by 1 pence. I worked out on average, depending on the size of your car, that saves you about 45 to 70 pence per every time you go to the filling station. Boy, did it get a lot of headlines about the fact that fuel duty was going down rather than up. Consequence for that was that they had to raise a series of taxes on oil companies operating in the North Sea that potentially are leading to cuts in investment there. But you start to see that things like environmental taxes have the ability to raise large amounts of money. So, because they are across a very wide base and a very broad spread of population. So literally, if you say to people, what's going to change people's behaviour about driving a car? Is it a movement of 1 pence up or down on the price of a litre of petrol? Or is it actually the fact that the cost of a litre of petrol has gone up over the last 3 years from £1 to £1.40? So you can start to see how different things sort of interact and behave in different ways. So let's think about fuel use. The price of fuel has gone up substantially. We've had lots of new taxes across Europe and other parts of the world that are all driven around carbon emissions on car engines. What's happened as a result of that?
Smaller cars.
Smaller cars, yeah. What else has happened?
Electric car, investment in electric cars.
Yep.
Increase in cycling.
Yes.
More public transport.
More public transport.
Proportion of family wealth going on cars.
Yes. More efficient cars. Yesterday, Range Rover launched a new Range Rover which is claimed will do 50 miles to the gallon. I can't do the miles per gallon to litre conversion because I come from the very old school where we still operate in weird currency. But can you imagine that? Could you ever have imagined 5 to 10 years ago a Range Rover doing 50 miles to the gallon? I mean, these are big things that drive around the streets. Okay, and I think there are 3 real drivers there. Number 1 is the fact that the cost of fuel has gone up. Number 2, the amount of fuel duties in petrol have gone up, which are causing people to want more efficient cars. And number 3, in the piece we haven't touched on that goes with taxes, is regulation. There are lots of rules that are coming into the EU, which are driven around the average emissions per fleet of vehicles that are produced by a manufacturer. So if you actually talk to anybody who works in the motor industry, they are all driven now by the need to produce low carbon cars. And I'm doing a session next week at another conference, and one of the things we're talking about is the automotive industry and how taxes can drive different behaviours. Now, is anybody here from the United States?
I've been doing it.
Okay. What's the price per gallon of fuel in the United States?
But it's gone up and it peaked in 2008, which rapidly.
Yeah, it peaked at about, if I remember correctly, wasn't it about $3 or something like that it peaked at, which was about £1.99, £2, which compares to an equivalent in the UK of about £7, £6.50, £7. There's virtually no fuel taxes on gasoline in America. And last year, the best-selling car in America was some form of very large four-wheel drive, oversized vehicle that wouldn't even fit on the narrow roads of Britain. Yet in contrast, the most popular car in the United Kingdom was one of the very small cars that we were talking about earlier as people's behaviour being driven by. And so you start to see that you could turn around and say, well, look, if you look at the price of difference between petrol in America and petrol in the UK, is that the differentiator between the two? And the answer to that is probably yes, it is. Which shows that if you put enough taxes on things, then it can start to change people's behaviour. But quite often only when delivered with a psychological message. Anybody here got any experience of Ireland?
What?
Ireland. Ireland introduced a plastic bag tax a couple of years ago. Now, this wasn't a very large amount of money, but something clearly either affronted the Irish people about it or caused them to change the behaviour. Does anybody know by what percentage, after the introduction of tax on the plastic bags, that the consumption of plastic bags went down by?
So massive, it's like 90%.
90%. And I went to Ireland a few weeks ago, and when I was a child, you used to have these little pull-along trolleys that your granny used to use with those nice tartan sort of colours that everyone could pretend they had some form of Scottish or Irish or Welsh background. And they were back in force, people walking down the streets of Dublin with these bags to put them in, reusing them the whole time for their shopping. 90%, which actually caused Tesco's to close its plastic bag factory in Ireland. So let's get on to the vexed question of carbon tax. You said you've... Yes, of course you can.
Yeah. In terms of the vehicle issue, has someone tracked the absolute emissions of vehicles in the UK and see whether there is an absolute emissions decline as a result of the tax or basket of fiscal instruments that we apply? Because that's really the truth. It's sure people are buying smaller cars, but maybe they're driving more, or maybe in the long run, the emissions reductions are negative?
I think it's almost impossible to track vehicle emissions on a per car basis.
No, absolute total emissions.
Absolute total emissions.
It'd be simple, because all you do is how much petrol's gone through the pump in the UK year on year, and that should give you an emissions factor and give you a figure.
I don't know the answer to that. I think that's a really good question.
The problem that I find with all this tweaking is that no one's measuring it against its ultimate objective.
Well, sorry, let's come back on that. I think actual absolute use of cars is going down, and I think it's going down for two reasons. I was looking at so I'm looking to get a new car, and I was looking yesterday at the vehicle excise duty, which is the tax that you pay on an annual basis for having a car on the British roads. And I looked at two different ones, same car, different engine in the same car, and one was a tax of £215 a year, and the other was a tax of £450. And you sit there and you think, that might change my behaviour, because I don't know if I want to pay £450. I think I might rather pay £250. And I think the anecdotal evidence is that you see less cars on the roads. And the ones that you do see tend to be smaller looking. You don't see that many big cars anymore. And if you talk to the manufacturers, and I haven't got the numbers off the top of my head, they will show you that there is a real shift towards lower emission cars. And actually, more than people just shifting towards smaller cars, every year the challenge that the manufacturers are setting themselves is to keep bringing the carbon emissions lower and lower and lower. And if you look at a lot of the advertising and the marketing that's used in the new car market in the UK, and I suspect this applies in a lot of other places, it's all driven around our car's got 99 grams per kilometre. Or the challenge that lots of manufacturers are setting themselves is, can they get themselves to the level of such low carbon emissions that actually there is no road tax that's payable at all? And conversely, if you go to a really low level of carbon emissions, I've started to see cars advertised in the UK that are doing 70 to 80 miles per gallon. Now you go back 25, 30 years ago, that just didn't happen. Yes?
Can you compare the situation with the developing country, for example, India, where now we have a $2,000 car,
Yes.
£2,000 sterling car? Hasn't that brought in a lot more consumption of the car? People previously traveling on public transport are now owning cars. Isn't that contributing to the increased emission of carbon?
I think you've just hit on what is the hardest debate around the whole of the thing about carbon emissions. If we go back to Copenhagen and to Mexico, and you look at some of the challenges that were reached there, and the challenges for governments around the world to say, actually, we're going to cut our carbon emissions, and you look at the targets that have been announced by the various governments. You've got the EU one, which is a reasonably robust number. You've got a US number, which actually ends up being a fraction in absolute terms of what the UK number is, but is a reduction. You get to China and India, and in China and India, it's not about reducing absolute numbers of carbon emissions. It's about, I think the Chinese use the phrase, it's about reducing the carbon emissions per unit of GDP generated, which actually means that the absolute number is going to keep on going up. Which means that the absolute number is going to keep on going up in the developing world, and there are very strong economic arguments for that to be the case, because the argument is that the developing world hasn't had the opportunity to increase the size of its economy and its living standards in the way that the developed world has. It means that if those keep going up, then either there has to be an even greater reduction in the emissions in the in the developed world. And when you pick the example of the £2,000 car, which I think is made by Tata, isn't it, in India? If you have the £2,000 car, that is right at the heart of that debate, because the reason that you're having that car is because there are more people who can afford to have cars and want the freedom that provides them with. But conversely, that's part of the reason why your carbon emissions in absolute numbers are going to go up in countries like India. Let's just come back to your point first about, the holistic piece around transport and behavioural change. I have a 23-year-old son who is going to be a physics teacher. I have no idea where he gets his interest in physics from, but he's just coming to the end of his teaching qualification. And he did a master's degree in mechanical and automotive engineering. And he's talking about getting his first job. And he's quite independent and determined and stubborn, and I have no idea where he gets that from whatsoever. And he drives 2 Land Rovers. 2. One of them is 30 years old and breaks down all the time. The other one he bought the other week for a very small amount of money, and he pays for them himself, and I think he paid £1,500 for it. And he goes, "Dad, it's great," he said. "It came with a book full of receipts for repair work for the last 20 years. I said, "I think that means it's quite likely to break down." So he went for a teaching interview at a school, and on his way back, the brakes failed. He said, "That was quite dangerous." I went, "Yes, you need your car to stop." Then he talked to me last night, and he said, "Well, I've applied for this job." And I said, "That's great," I've said, "but you're going to be on a teacher's salary, which is not a huge amount of money. I don't think you can afford to have that job in that school and drive there and back every day, because it's going to take you an hour and a half each way, because you're going to have to go over a particular junction of the motorway, and it's going to cost you a fortune in petrol." And I think your point there is absolutely right, which is how is the tax system and the costs actually driving different behaviours? Because if you go back 30, 40 years ago, people lived where they worked. And now people don't necessarily live where they work. I live over 100 miles from where I work. So I take public transport down on a Monday morning, and I stay in London for 3 nights, and then I go back home again on public transport. I wouldn't want to do that commute every day. Wouldn't be efficient, it would be quite tiring, and it would be very expensive. But we've got to a situation where more and more people are mobility-wise very different from where they work, from where they live. And the same thing happens with our families. If you think about how dispersed your family is compared to where perhaps your parents' family or your grandparents' families were, we have diversified as people have gone to where economic opportunities exist. I have 3 siblings. I'm the only one who lives in the UK. Everybody else lives a long way away. I'm sure it's nothing to do with me. Yes?
I just wanted to introduce a related, I guess, slightly obvious point, is that you're talking very specifically about the relationship between tax and behaviour change. But of course that doesn't assume that there's any attitudinal or value change going on.
Correct. 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 Yes. Yes.
The money we save on our fuel by having a more efficient car, we then spend going to Disneyland.
Yes, and I think that's a really important point, because the point that I constantly make when I meet with governments around the world actually comes back to a point that somebody else made in the room, which is actually some of these things they do are small. So you talk about the Brazilian taxes, nobody really wants to put a tax on because actually it makes you really very unpopular. In the same way, I say to people, that taxes and regulation are only policy instruments, and on their own they achieve nothing. You actually have to have a proper campaign around behaviour. And I met recently with somebody from the Department of Energy in the UK, a very senior guy, advises the senior minister. And I said to him, look, if you want people to change behaviour, don't just put a carbon tax which impacts on gas and electricity prices. Why don't you run a campaign that says at home, if you reduce the temperature in your house by 1 degree and put a jumper on in the winter rather than sitting there in a t-shirt, you will save yourself this amount on average on your gas and electricity bill, and you will save this amount in carbon emissions. Unless you are actually trying to educate people at the same time as to what it is that you're trying to do and why, tax on its own fails. A lot of the stuff about taxes is that people introduce carbon taxes, and the French tried to introduce carbon tax a couple of years ago, and then it all went wrong after the French farmers decided they didn't want it and went to court and had it ruled unconstitutional. The whole plan of the French government was to introduce it at a small level and then gradually increase it until people had got used to it. And does anybody know what happens if you put a frog in a pan of water? You keep on turning the temperature up, and the frog doesn't notice until it's dead that it's dead. And I have a fear that the same thing happens with environmental taxes, and that if you really want to change behaviour, you actually have to either introduce a fantastic incentive scheme, and we're just going to come on to incentives in a minute, or you have to have a very large amount of tax immediately. But the problem with having a large amount of tax immediately is that no government wants to go down that route because they're very concerned about the impact it would have on their economy in a globally competitive society. So you do have a little bit of a catch-22 situation, which I think neatly leads us into the question of incentives and how incentives might work. Has anybody here got any practical experience of incentives?
I just comment on the summary of your bit.
Yes, of course.
When you were talking about getting the train, I think you were talking about usage versus, so potentially tax or incentive on usage versus tax on fuel, which is quite a different thing. So if you, I just work with a climate group in the States, which is an incentive thing, and we were looking at ways of incentivising reduced car usage by working with the insurance companies to lower your premium if you didn't use your car 1 day a week. So if you use public transport instead of commuting, you bring down the premium because every Friday you choose not to be in your car, so you don't want to crash on Friday, so the premium kind of comes down. So I think it's interesting to think about not just tax on the fuel that you burn, but tax on your overall usage and that, or incentive on your usage. And then you can think about employees not coming in, doing three days in the office, not 5, or all sorts of different schemes that would actually reduce your need for the car.
Yes, I quite like that because I think of tax on fuel as being a proxy for a tax on usage, because obviously the more you use, the more expensive it is. But I think your point about incentivisation is a really strong one. And let's pick feed-in tariffs because Ralph, you mentioned feed-in tariffs earlier as being a good incentive. They are a phenomenal mechanism for encouraging people to change their behaviour. And in the UK, we've introduced feed-in tariffs, and they have been so popular that the government has capped the amount that can be spent on feed-in tariffs, and is doing an urgent review because a couple of people have decided that. Yes, sorry, let me do that. A feed-in tariff is basically a financial incentive that is paid for generation of renewable energy. So it depends on which country you're in, exactly what it is that's incentivised. In the UK, if you have photovoltaic cells, every kilowatt hour of electricity that's generated, you receive a payment of just over 43 pence tax-free from the system, I'll call it, for 25 years, index-linked, which is roughly the 4 times of the cost of buying carbon electricity in the system. 4 times. If you have used renewable heat in the UK, the plan is that you will be paid something like 7 pence per unit of heat generated. Now, if you apply that in the context of ground source heating, for every 1 kilowatt hour of electricity that you put in, cost 10 pence, you will get somewhere between 3 and 4 kilowatts hour of heat out. Payment 21 to 28 pence. So renewable heat incentive and other feed-in tariffs are a mechanism of encouraging people to shift how it is that they run their fuel, irrespective of the efficiency or otherwise of the equipment.
Just to clarify, Mark, that's where you set it back?
No.
For your own
That's for your own consumption. Any surplus that you sell back to the system on electricity generates a further payment of 3 pence, which is small by comparison. The design is basically, it means that if you put PV cells in, the feed-in tariff system is intended to work so that after an 8-year period it's paid for itself. Now, that doesn't necessarily work. Whilst that's a really positive system, that doesn't work unless you happen to have the capital payment up front that you need to put that size of system on your property. And at the moment, there are some grants for renewable heat, but there are no grants for PV and no low finance loans available. But it is causing, that incentive is causing different behaviour, which is you look at some of the large UK utility companies, their behaviour is now changed so that they are willing to put PV panels on the roof of your house for free. You get the benefit of the free electricity that those generate, they get the benefit of the feed-in tariff. And so some very entrepreneurial people have decided that they're going to build some big farms of photovoltaic cells. And by building big farms of photovoltaic cells, they are generating huge payments. And the immediate reaction of the government is, that wasn't what we intended. We're going to do an urgent review, and that review will be completed within the next 6 to 9 months. So immediately, what that causes is instability in the system, because an incentive people thought they were entitled to, they might now not be entitled to. Therefore, they stop investing. Therefore, the low carbon route they could have gone down stops. So then you get back to the question, well, if you want people to invest in low carbon and you're willing to pay this amount per unit of low carbon electricity generated, why does it matter who is the person that benefits from it? Because if you really want to have massive low carbon generation, it's going to take people who've got large amounts of capital who will do the same thing that people with large amounts of capital always do, which is they'll look at the level of the return on their investment. And the worst possible thing that you can do when you're trying to encourage the move to a low carbon economy is to constantly change your policy or change your rates or change the taxes or incentives that apply to people, because we are, lots of people here have indicated that they're working with groups that are looking at low carbon generation and things like that. If you're going to invest in some form of low carbon generation, whether it's a wind farm or whether it is a large PV farm or whether it's a nuclear power station, without any comment on other environmental impacts of any of those, whatever you're going to do with those, they are not projects that you set up in 3 months that have a payback period of 1 year. Those are projects where the return is driven over 10, 20 or 30-year period. In a world of constrained capital investment, people have to look at those things. And one of the things they look at is regulation, tax and incentives, because they have to know what the return is. And then you get back to your point, which is you have to actually do more than to encourage behavioural change with people, so that people start to think, I remember when I was a child that, that suddenly the whole thing came about having to wear seatbelts in the back of a car. And I remember when my kids were small, they would just go, seatbelt, you've not got your seatbelt on, because they were educated in that way. I now, when I take my 6-year-old to school, he and I have these conversations about the park and ride bus, because the other week he said, I don't really understand what the park and ride bus is all about. So we had this conversation, and I said, how big's that bus? How long is it? And we said it's about the length of 6 cars. I said, well, actually, no. I said it's about 4 or 5, but let's not quibble about detail. I said, how many people in the cars all around us? About 2, Daddy. I said, yes. I said, how many people on that bus? And he looked there and he said 12. I said, yes, there are 12 on there, but in theory there could be up to about 70 people on that bus. I said, so what would it be like? How many, if we had 80 people on that bus, how many cars would we need? And with a little bit of help, because I didn't have the patience for him to work out the calculation himself, I said, you'd have about 20 cars on the road. I said, how far would 20 cars stretch from? He said, well, from here to the lights. I said, so that creates congestion. I said, yes. I said, and we'd be having lots more carbon in the air. Car and ride bus is low carbon. It saves on parking in the town centre. It saves people money. So we went through the whole debate, and then he got very confused. I said, and we'll have reduced carbon emissions. He said, I thought that was a bad thing. I go, no, George, reducing carbon emissions is a good thing. Let's work on that basis. But education. So he now every time we go through the park and ride bus, I get him to tell me the whole story all the way through, so that he understands what the benefit is. And in fact, I think he said to me the other day, I said, can we please take the park and ride bus one day? I go, yeah, of course we can. No problem, we'll take the park and ride bus. And you can do a video about it and tell all your friends at school. But I think these things all come together. I think we've covered 3 really important areas. Put out that taxes are out there. but they don't necessarily represent the solution to all of the problem, because we've got incentives that need to be thought about as a different way of changing people's behaviour, plus also the whole communication piece and the broader social problems that have been talked about, you know, what are the dynamics that are driving this, what are the other factors that will actually change people's behaviour. And then also, I think, you know, the most important thing for this is how this is all put into an international context, because the international context is hugely important, and particularly the dilemma that we picked up on the, you know, on the attitudes in places like India and China versus the attitudes in the UK. And we didn't, this is probably a good thing, we didn't actually get onto the political polarisation that takes place in the United States, which really, I think, you know, has to be resolved if we're going to get to this challenge. And the politicians in the US probably need to catch up where businesses in America, where there are a lot of innovations that are starting to drive low carbon behaviours. Thank you very much. That was a very lively debate, and more than happy to chat afterwards.